Okay, everybody, let's get started. Welcome to the Canary Wharf headquarters in London of the EBRD, and welcome to this launch of the EBRD's new transition report. My name is Richard Porter. I'm the Managing Director of Communications here at the bank. And the topic we're discussing today of industrial policy couldn't really be more timely, I think. In the wake of recent economic shocks, governments and leaders worldwide, from the US and the EU to China, are turning to industrial policies to reshape their economies and to boost growth. Earlier this year, the former Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi unveiled an industrial master plan aimed at refueling growth in the EU. And of course, President-elect Donald Trump promises larger tariffs to protect American industries. Today we hear that could be 25% for Mexico and Canada and a 10% extra tariff for China. How will other nations react if or when this happens? And there's a long history of industrial policy in use in the global economy. In fact, the transition report will tell you that it dates back to 1791 when Alexander Hamilton made the case for industrial self-sufficiency for the United States. So there's no such thing as a new argument here. But when and how to use industrial policy has always been a subject for debate. And our report, published today, examines the uses of industrial policy in the current times, in the EBRD regions and beyond, analysing their effectiveness, the impact and the potential pitfalls. So we'll be hearing shortly from our Chief Economist, Beata Javorcik, and our expert panel of speakers who'll be joining us. But let's start first with the EBRD President, Adil Renaud-Bassot, who has recorded this message for us.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's transition report launch and discussion on industrial policy. This subject is of great relevance to the regions where the EBRD operates. The world economy is evolving fast. Climate change and artificial intelligence, new levels of global competition and geostrategic rivalry, wars and shifting supply chains. All confront our countries with challenges and opportunities. Fostering sustainable economic growth and resilience is not getting any easier. Industrial policy is potentially one way of managing such turbulence. You can certainly argue that industrial policy helps diversify economies, increase productivity, and create jobs. Strategic investments in innovation, green technology, and critical industries can support economies, making the transition from reliance on natural resources or lower value industries. On the other hand, many would caution that industrial policy is risky. It can distort markets and lead to the misallocation of resources and other inefficiencies. Poorly designed or politically motivated policies could favor some industries or businesses at the expense of the overall health of the market. Today, we will look at both the benefits and risks of such an approach. And given the quality of our guests, I'm sure we will be much better informed on the subject at the end of the discussion.
So thanks to Adil for providing that context. And let me now introduce the EBRD Chief Economist and Professor of Economics at Oxford University, Beata Javorcik. Beata, please join us.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us for the launch of our latest report on navigating industrial policy. Let me start by thanking the team that has worked very hard on this report, and in particular our colleague Helena, who is in hospital today, so she cannot be with us here. This report is very rich. And I am not going to do justice to this report in this very short presentation. I'm going to give you just some highlights, starting with introduction to industrial policy, talking about structural changes that have happened in the economies of our countries of operations, then looking at regional policy, policy as a type of industrial policy, and then finally focusing on policies directed to firms. And I hope that by showing you some of these highlights, I am going to encourage you to actually read at least parts of the report. Now, what is industrial policy? This is a broad term that encompasses interventions that are aiming to change the productive structure of the economy. And the textbook Case for Industrial Policy talks about externalities, about market failures or coordination failures. So think about addressing environmental degradation or diffusion of knowledge from innovators to the industry. And in the textbook Case for Industrial Policy, government intervention is warranted because the market most likely will not deliver the efficient outcome. Now, industrial policy used to be very popular in the 70s, 80s, and then it seems to have gone out of fashion together with disco, but it's back. It's back with a vengeance, and it's back in both advanced economies and in developing countries. And as you can see here, both the United States and China are avid users of industrial policy. You also see that poorer countries like India, our EBRD regions are also joining the bandwagon of industrial policy. Now, industrial policy is back with a by popular demand. When you ask people, are you in favor of the state playing a greater role in the economy? In post-communist countries, among those who are over 60, more than half of the respondents say, yes, we want more state in the economy. And when you compare the light brown line to the line one below, you see that the share of respondents favoring greater role of the state has increased from the pre-COVID time to today. And then the dotted line shows you that it actually has gone up to the views in the late 1990s. Of course, post-communist countries are not the only places where the public demands more state involvement. You see a similar pattern in advanced economies. Now, the discourse on industrial policies has changed. It used to be vilified a couple decades ago. Now it's treated more like a silver bullet. But it's not a silver bullet because there are some disturbing features of industrial policy. As you can see here, in vast majority of cases, industrial policy discriminates against foreign interest, thus undermining the equal treatment of foreign and national firms. In vast majority of cases, industrial policies do not have an expiration date. They are enacted without a clear endpoint, and which poses the risk of policies perpetuating themselves and making it difficult for government to correct the course. What's also disturbing is the fact that these policies often have multiple objectives. And these objectives often do not have clear hierarchy. So think about the discourse in Europe. We want rapid electrification of transport. We want rapid rollout of electric vehicles. But at the same time, we want to protect employment in automotive industry through tariffs. And we are not very keen on giving consumer subsidies for purchase of electric vehicles. These objectives are on a direct collision course with each other. What do you need to do industrial policy? Well, you need two things. You need money, fiscal space, and you need bureaucratic capabilities. If you are an advanced economy and you have both, you do the difficult and expensive industrial policy, like state aid, like trade, like some sort of financial assistance to firms investing abroad. But if you are poor, if you are less developed, if you have neither fiscal space nor administrative capacity, you go for the cheap and easy. The most distortive types of industrial policy, such as export quotas, export bans, licensing requirements in foreign trade. And what's disturbing is the fact that these distortive policies are often undertaken by countries where control of corruption is not really there, thus posing the risk of policies being captured by West and causing more distortion, more harm than good. Moving on to structural change, right? Remember, industrial policy is about promoting structural change. And the name includes the word industry, but actually industrial policy can pertain to services as well. It's a broad term. Now, our countries, particularly countries with post-communist legacies, entered 1990s with underdeveloped services sectors. So over the last 30 years, we have seen a decline in the share of value of manufacturing and an increase in services. And actually, that's a trend that we've seen in advanced economies as well. Turkey is one of the countries that seems to be defying this trend. Now, the traditional model of growth used to be from agriculture to manufacturing to services. But as you see on this graph, up till the global financial crisis, many countries have enjoyed growth led by manufacturing exports. This has become increasingly difficult to a large extent because of greater competition in the global economy, particularly from China. And very soon it's going to be even more difficult due to countries erecting barriers. Instead, what we see is more and more countries growing thanks to services or a combination of services and manufacturing. Digitalization allows cross-border provision of services, export of services. And exports of services are not done only by services firms. When in the chapter we zoom in on Hungary, we demonstrate that a lot of exports are actually, a lot of services are actually exported by manufacturing firms. And one of those global trends is the change in the composition of workforce in manufacturing, in particular the share of occupations that are typically found in services is increasing in manufacturing firms. This trend is very pronounced in advanced Europe. It seems that our EU countries of operations are on the way to get there. Now, quite a few of our countries of operations have been very successful in exporting services, high-value services. Here you see that some of them have done very well in exporting computer services. So here we depict the value of computer services exports relative to GDP. And you see Estonia, Ukraine, Serbia, and Armenia being among top exporters there. Now, you can use industrial policy in the form of investment promotion to bring FDI in services to your country, and actually services are targeted by investment promotion agencies in our most developed countries of operations. But you can also do something else. Namely, our analysis indicates that liberalizing, opening your own services industry, and thus bringing competition, bringing knowledge flow, it's a good predictor of success in exporting services. So it's not just industrial policy. Old-fashioned liberalization policies can deliver as well. Moving on to regional policies. Now, industrial policy can take many forms. It can target firms, it can target sectors, or it can target regions. And there is a long history of industrial policy targeting lagging regions. In our countries of operations, we have persistent regional inequality, as you see on this map. We also have a growing rural-urban divide. If what predicts a person's income, so this is household income adjusted for the number of people, you see that people born in rural areas tend to have a lower chance of achieving higher income than people born in urban areas. And this divide has been growing for later age cohorts. So how do you remedy this? One way of remedying regional disparities is to set up special economic zones. The hope is if you cannot fix business climate in the whole country, you can improve things in a small area. And you bring in this way additional business, and the hope is prosperity to that area. And special economic zones have been used enthusiastically by our regions of operations, exceeding more than 1,000 such zones in 2020. So in the report, we ask, are these special economic zones delivering? And the answer is yes, they are delivering. If you look at economic activity within 20-kilometer radius, so this is going not just looking at the zone itself, but going beyond, you see increased economic activity. So zones are bringing more economic activity and hopefully prosperity to their location. But how do you pick the zones that will bring this prosperity? Where do you place this zone? And here, the analysis shows that it's actually not that easy to predict which zones will do well. What the analysis in the chapter shows is that zones do better if they are close to a port, if they are in a location with lots of people with university education, if they are in a place where institutions, particularly law and order, are better. So in other words, better institutions are important for the success of special economic zones. Now let me move on to firms. Very many industrial policies are supporting individual firms, supporting national champions is one of the stated goals of many industrial policies. Now, if you look at the profile of firms in EBRD regions as well as in advanced economies, you see that vast majority of firms are small. They have fewer than 10 workers. Large firms are few and far in between. But it is the large firms that account for vast majority of employment and value added. For a large share, maybe not vast majority, for a large share of total value added. Now, in the chapter, we sing the praises of large firms. Why? Because when you order firms by size, and the horizontal axis in these charts should say it's the size on next 0, small firms. As you go further, larger firms, you see that larger firms are the ones who innovate, who engage in process innovation, product innovation, and who undertake R&D activities. And this is true both in the EBRD regions as well as in advanced economies. The chapter also sings praises of young firms. Our analysis shows that if you look at net employment creation, it is young firms of all sizes that are actually responsible for employment creations. And in particular, startups, firms that have potential to grow large, are firms that are worth supporting. And in the chapter, we discuss our own EBRD's Star Venture program. Now, the transition report always has a structural reform chapter assessing progress in transition in our countries of operations. This year, for the first time, we have included our 6 sub-Saharan African member countries, where we hope to start operations next year. As you would expect, in line with their income per capita, they tend to score lower in terms of our transition scores. So, to close, what are the lessons from the analysis? We provide a recipe, a cookbook, a list of things policymakers should consider when engaging in industrial policy in order to maximize the benefit. We also provide a recipe list for countries with less deep pockets and lower administrative capacity. But if I were to summarize what the message in one sentence, it is, while industrial policy can deliver in some cases, it is very hard to get it right. So one should use it sparingly. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Beata. Really fascinating. And we are now going to turn to our panel discussion to unpick what all of this means. And we have a stellar lineup for you today. Here with us, we have Jeromin Zettelmeyer, Director of Bruegel, the European Union's economic think tank, EBRD alumni as well. Welcome, Jeromin. And on the screen, we have both joining us from New York. Hopefully, we can see them soon. We have Rana Foroohar, global business columnist and associate editor at the Financial Times, and Joseph Joe Stiglitz, Nobel laureate in economics and professor at Columbia University. Thank you both for joining us this morning in New York. A really great panel. And as I wanted to say as well, you're wondering about the Slido code on the screen. At the end of our discussion, we'll also be taking some questions from the audience, either here or watching online. The Slido QR code gives you access to the site where you can place your questions, and we'll read from those when we get to that stage. But what we're going to do first is invite our three guest speakers to spend a few minutes providing their perspective on the topics that have been raised so far, the key themes of the transition report. And I'm going to start with you, Rana, if that's okay. So you've heard Beata's introduction. Tell us what your perspective is on this.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for particularly having me with such an eminent panel. It's great to be here. I want to just take my 5 minutes and pull the aperture out a bit and then also narrow it a bit. And what I would say is, when I think about industrial policy and the political economy in general, I like to think about hundreds of years of history and the way in which the political economy itself is a bit like a pendulum that tends to shift back and forth and be a bit purpose-built for its time, and things sort of work until they don't, until they get too extreme. And so, you could look at, say, 18th century mercantilism as one political economy, and it sort of went and went and went until it didn't work anymore. And then you get 19th century laissez-faire, and you get a period of more integration and globalization. And eventually that turns into financialization and speculation. And you start to get financial vulnerabilities. And all of this arguably ends up in the 1929 crash that then heralds in a different kind of political economy. FDR's New Deal, more interventionist, the need for more state control becomes evident. And that political economy goes on until the late 1970s. And then you get the last shift, which is the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. And I bring this all up because I think it's very important to understand where we've been for the last half century, to understand where we're going, and what not only the risks, but also the needs for industrial policy might be. So, the Reagan-Thatcher revolution heralded, as we all know, this period of deregulation, certainly a lot of global trade and integration, many good things, a lot of poverty reduction, but also a lot of financialization, a lot of speculation. And that's, of course, because capital was able to move across borders more freely than either goods or people. So that's one of the reasons why, in advance, particularly of 2008, but still today, you have such a extreme divide between the financial markets and the real economy in nation states, right? So Wall Street v. Main Street. And that gets to the heart, and this is true, I'm speaking in US lingo here, but this is true in Europe, it's true in most developed countries, certainly, and in some developing ones. So you get this situation, which is then illuminated by the financial crisis, by the COVID pandemic, by the war in Ukraine, where you begin to see the fragilities in this system. We don't have enough resilience. Countries cannot produce basic PPE. 92% of all high-end semiconductors are made in Taiwan, which is one of the most geopolitically contentious places on the planet. Add to this the fact that over that time, you've had the rise of economies like China that are not characterized by this sort of Washington consensus paradigm. And you've got a system that maybe was purpose-built for a time, but the pendulum has now swung so far to the extreme that it's time for a change. And we began to see this, of course, during COVID. It became part of the felt experience of many, many people around the world, which is why we're having this conversation today. I happen to believe that nothing really resonates until it's very much part of people's felt experience. And so, in the U.S., you saw in the Biden administration in 2021, Joe Biden coming out and saying, you know what? It's no longer about just the consumer. It's no longer about share prices going up and consumer prices going down. We need more resiliency. We need to think about more balance between production and consumption. We need to think about market inefficiencies and what are the markets not giving us that we need? For example, like the clean energy transition, like basic resiliency in the form of semiconductors. Europe then follows, and we can get into the details of some of these policies and how they might differ. But I think, by and large, it was a good thing to have multiple nodes of semiconductor production, at least 3, maybe 4. I think it's a good thing for the U.S. to become more integrated into the green energy transition in its own way. Now, Donald Trump presents an entirely different challenge, which I know we'll come to in later questions. But all of this is to say that I believe industrial policy, industrial strategy, of which there are many kinds, all right? And this report does a great job of pointing that out, is part of what is going to be needed for this new pendulum shift towards an economy at the nation state level that integrates and reconnects Wall Street and Main Street. Because frankly, the reason that we have the polarized politics that we do, and the reason that we have some of the risks of the more protectionist, less efficient, more destructive is because the global market system became unmoored from the realities of many people on the ground in nation states, and that is not a sustainable political situation. So we need growth that is sustainable and inclusive. I think industrial policy can be an important part of that, but as you say, it can also be weaponized, and I know that we'll have the chance to get more into the details of all that later.
I think quite a positive outlook, perhaps, but we may want to know where that pendulum's going to take us, I think. So let's go next to Joe Stiglitz, if that's all right. Joe, can you hear us okay? Could you give us your opening perspective? We can't hear you.
Let me begin by first picking up on what Rana said. I think the major motivation for the resurgence of industrial policy is the failure of a world without industrial policy. And we saw that in the failure to deal with the green transition, the failure of resilience evidenced in COVID-19, the failure, precariousness that is posed by the lack of chips, excessive dependence on Taiwan, and the failure in place-based policies. We're left with large parts of the United States and in other countries devastated, and people seemingly left behind. None of this should have occurred in the kind of neoliberal model that has dominated for the last 40 years. But let me first also mention that while neoliberalism took the view that industrial policy was a no-no, and I remember a famous quip by Mike Boskin, who was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Bush, it doesn't make any difference whether a country produces potato chips or computer chips. Industrial policies were disparaged. At the same time, throughout this period of the 90s and the 2000s, industrial policy was being practiced. And it was being practiced both in developing and developed countries. As chief economist of the World Bank, I pushed industrial policies. My successor, Justin Lin, pushed them even more. We worked with Ethiopia, Rwanda, South Africa, and the United States. I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Clinton. At the same time, we were telling other countries not to have industrial policies. We were practicing them all the time. We talked about dual purpose. We were engaged in industrial policies. So let's be clear, there is a discrepancy between the practice and the reality. One part of this that I want to emphasize is every country actually has an industrial policy. It's just that some countries don't know it. And because they don't know it, it becomes subject to capture. In the United States, we had industrial policy, which was financial policy. We gave derivatives first claimant in the event of bankruptcy. That was a subsidy to derivatives. We encouraged derivatives. It was a very bad policy, let me make it clear, and it was a reflection of capture. But you cannot not have an industrial policy because you have to write rules and regulations, design an education system. You have to have a legal framework, and the way you make decisions affects the shape of the economy, the choice of technology. So let's be clear, we cannot get away from industrial policy. We just have to be thoughtful about it. The evidence is very clear that industrial policies, when well managed, have had enormous returns. When I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, we did an estimate of the returns in our investments, and they were so much higher than any set of investments in the private sector. More recently, there's some research. We've had a conference here at Columbia University, and people have done research on the return on public investments in research, public investments, part of our industrial policy, and again, enormous returns. So let's be clear that there can be very successful industrial policies. The internet is an example. Our pharmaceuticals are examples. In fact, as I say, you can't think of America without thinking of our successful industrial policies. Yes, there have been failures, but my view is if there were not failures, that would be evidence that we were not undertaking enough risk. That a good industrial policy has some successes, some failures. What we want to look at is the average return, and the average return has been extraordinarily high. One aspect of industrial policy that's come up a number of times already is the term distortions. And I want to make clear the framework from which we talk about distortions. In the back of many people's minds is the view that unfettered markets are efficient. But we've known for a very long time, since the work of Arrow and DeBrew and the work that I did with Bruce Greenwald, that in general, the conditions under which competitive markets, or markets in general, lead to efficiency are very, very restrictive. And therefore, you can say markets are distorted. We see it in the monopoly power, but we see it also in the failures under neoliberalism that are so pervasive. Back in the 1980s, I did work with David Newberry, and we showed that free trade in the absence of a complete set of risk markets, can make everybody better off. Everybody worse off. That is to say, rather than free trade being Pareto improving, it could actually make everybody in all countries worse off because of the induced risk that's associated with it. More recently, Martin Guzman and I have shown that in a world with endogenous innovation, the kinds of rules that are embedded in the WTO ensure the maintenance of pre-existing inequalities, the exacerbations of those inequalities. They are partly responsible for the fact that we have seen the maintenance of neocolonial patterns of trade, where developing countries have continued to produce primary products. The whole so-called unfettered trade system of the WTO has resulted in the poorer countries remaining poor. And I welcome, and I've advocated the use of industrial policies by developing countries to catch up. Now, the fact that industrial policies can be intellectually defended so clearly, in fact, that the laissez-faire cannot be defended intellectually, is a major change in our understanding. We didn't have that understanding 40 years ago, 50 years ago, but we do have that understanding today. So today, the questions are not about whether there should be industrial policies. As I've always said, every country effectively has them. The question is, what should be the more precise objectives, what should be the instruments, and how it can be implemented. And I can only touch on these, but the objectives obviously should focus on the key market failures, green, resilience, R&D. In fact, in the area of so important where they are R&D, that in much of my work in the over the last 20 years in talking about industrial policy has focused on learning policies, but also place-based policies. We've done work that shows that integrating the multiple objectives, including social objectives, can actually enhance that can be complementarities across these various objectives. But at the, it is clear that in a world with multiple objectives, in some cases, there will be trade-offs. That's part of the democratic process. I think we've made a mistake in some of our trade-offs. We put, for instance, job creation above protecting the planet. Europe has done that, and the United States in keeping out some of the solar panels and EVs. There will have been better ways of catching up in EVs and solar panels than protectionism, and Europe and the United States are wealthy enough to engage in those, and I am critical of those. So those are the broad objectives that I think today. Secondly, there are the instruments, and I think there needs to be a broader set of instruments than maybe have been put on the table. I'm looking here at the experience of in many countries in the United States, in East Asia, where they very successfully introduced their East Asian miracle was partly based on industrial policies. But in addition to the trade protection that's been talked about, the grants, which can take forms of both the money and equity, and one of the mistakes we made of not being subtle enough in the kinds of contractual arrangements and making sure the right ways of putting skin in the game has been done. We've relied, I think, maybe too much on tax credits, but in East Asia, lending policy was very important. Procurement in many cases is an important instrument. of industrial policy. And many of these instruments can be undertaken in countries without fiscal space. And the report emphasized the balance that different countries are in different situations. Let me finally turn to the implementation. And here, I think thinking about skin in the game can affect incentives, it can affect the self-selection mechanism, reducing the burden on monitoring. I also, and also reducing the scope for political economy problems, corruption. Some of the instruments may not be as fine targeted, may contribute less to additionality. Some of them enable addressing multiple objectives at low costs. But the many of the issues that were raised by the report, particularly in the final slide, I think are really important. A constant review process. There are a few other things that I wanted to add to the list.
Joe, do you mind if I just interrupt you now? Sorry, I hesitate to stop a Nobel laureate in mid-sentence, but I'll run out of questions to ask you if I let you keep going for a minute. Do you mind if I just hear from Jeromin for a few minutes? And I want to come back to your points about the instruments, if that's all right. So, Jeromin, I'd just like to get your perspective, perhaps a slightly more European perspective on this as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to give a European perspective, but not an EU perspective, right? So you mischaracterized Bruegel a little bit as an EU think tank. We are as EU as the EBRD is. We have, a strong EU membership, but we are more than just the EU, and particularly the UK is a member of Bruegel, and we're very proud of that. Okay, so let me basically just give you a reaction to the report and what I learned from it, and then maybe say one or two things in reaction to what Joe and Rana have said so far. So, I mean, the most important thing I can say that this is, far and beyond the strongest policy report on industrial policy that I've seen so far. So it is everything that a transition report is supposed to be. It is research-based, it's rigorous, it is nuanced, it produces information about the EBRD region that you could not read anywhere else, and it produces information beyond the EBRD region. It's the perfect blend of giving industrial policy its due and pointing to some risks, and importantly, also pointing to policies that can minimize those risks. So the main message is, great job. This is a real gift, this report. Okay, then my sense of where this report sort of pushes the boundaries. So let me run down what I think of as a consensus view on industrial policy. Probably it's something that the three of us will share, and I think this is a view that sort of, at least in the academic world, starts with Roderick's 2004 paper. So it way precedes the global financial crisis, way precedes COVID. So first, you need state intervention to correct market failures. Of course, that's super old. Second, some market failures, specific market failures, justify financial incentives by the state. That's how I would define industrial policy in a narrow sense, and so that includes, this learning by doing externalities that you need to, in a sense, give, the infant industry argument. Essentially, that's the original industrial policy argument from like, technical changes. Technical changes endogenous, which is a point that Joe made. There is a persistence or path dependency in technical change. This is important, particularly if you want technical change of a type that can deal with climate externalities. And then an important point that Rana made is that, in a pure laissez-faire system, you might get excess specialization, right? So you might get in a, Ricardian sort of trade system, everyone just produces one good, which is great for efficiency, but if something goes wrong and the goods don't come, you're screwed, okay? And you're particularly screwed if there are malevolent actors out there, which we kind of didn't think of as economists for the last whatever. Actually, Adam Smith did, but most economists didn't really think of this, right? So for these sorts of things, you do actually, you need something like industrial policy. And then the final point is the state there's a trade-off between essentially state failure and market failure, and the state is more likely to fail, I think, if industrial policy is, in a sense, infiltrated by motives that go beyond the correction of market failures. Right? And the two prime ones that always infiltrate industrial policy historically and particularly now are, first, this is supposed to be about protecting jobs, particularly industrial jobs, and secondly, winning international competitions against other countries. And so in the presence of these other motives, you get things that sort of masquerade as protecting market failures but don't actually do a good job. Okay, so that's the consensus. It's already, I think, quite sophisticated. Now, the report makes it even more sophisticated. So this is where it adds. So first, there is a ton of new evidence in three areas: export-led, the development of export-led ICT sectors, regional development. So this beautiful chapter on special economic zone and young firms, and it's all grounded on the EBRD region. So we get a lot of new information, both on the success stories and potential failures, what the state can improve. And a much more granular view than simply say, we need to stay pro-competitive, or we need to be worried about the balance between the state and the market. So it gets a lot more granular than that. And then finally, there is a whole ton of new evidence on trends, motives, and implementation of industrial policy around the world. Right? This is chapter 1. It's really a good chapter. And so what I learned is there's really a big pickup in industrial policy. So it's not quite true to say we've always done it, we have never identified. There is actually a big pickup. Like Rana said, the pendulum has started swinging, not just now, but it started swinging more or less with the global financial crisis in the other direction. The second, maybe surprising fact is this is driven by advanced economies. Not surprising in a political economy sense, right? Because, that's where the global financial crisis happened. But if you think of the sort of the traditional justifications of industrial policy, particularly the learning by doing argument, this is supposed to be more of a developing country thing, right? It's they that need industrial policy to sort of, in a sense, level the playing field with the advanced countries. So it's a bit surprising that this is advanced country-led. Then, it reflects these multiple motives and objectives, including geopolitical competition, protection of jobs, which is something to worry about. And then finally, on implementation, the stunning fact, really stunning fact, that it's normally discriminatory. Most industrial policies are discriminatory. That's not something that the global social planner would necessarily tell you, right? Then this point that there's a trade-off between distorsiveness of policies, or, to use a less loaded word, the harmfulness of some policies and required bureaucratic capacity. And finally, this idea that firm-based policies are the norm, and particularly in advanced countries. Again, something that raises a red flag. So what's the bottom line for me? I mean, first of all, I really love it that EBRD has taken the bull by the horns, right? Because there's sort of, the genes of EBRD are very much the Washington Consensus genes, right? EBRD is a product of the Reagan-Thatcher revolution of sorts, and it's become increasingly sophisticated about how to deal with this legacy. And, for some time, I would say at least, 12 or 14 years since I was at EBRD, we have understood that the purpose of the institutions is not to move the world from the state continuum to the sort of market extreme, but rather to find ways in which state and markets can work together better, right? And so the creation of industrial policy is the latest challenge to finding this a good balance and complementarities, and I think this chapter does it very well. The final point, though, is I am a bit disturbed by the characterization of the policies. So the overwhelming impression I have is that if you look at what has actually happened, what is driving these policies is less sort of the pendulum swinging from state to markets, but rather the pendulum swimming from basically between, on the us versus them continuum, right? It's really about international cooperation, international integration. It's whether policies should be discriminating. It's about making the home team win against the foreign team, also internationally. And that represents a very big challenge to the mission of EBRD and to the parts of what maybe I'm calling old-fashioned. I would call it the rules-based international order, which for the most part has been a great thing, Right? It has enabled China and India to prosper. It has lifted millions, billions possibly, out of poverty. It was a reaction to the economic nationalism of the 1930s. And from what I can hear and see, a lot is taking us back into that economic nationalism, and there is no institution that has so much to lose from this than EBRD, because EBRD is about promoting good economic policies through international integration. It's about international integration as a force of good. And if advanced countries turn nationalist under the guise of industrial policy, that's going to be really bad for the transition region.
Okay, thank you. Very, very interesting on that last point there. I'm going to go to Beata now, actually. As much as anything, you've now heard our three panelists. I just wanted to perhaps get a bit of a take from you on all three of the comments you've heard and what your response would be so far.
So let me get back to the reasons why the pendulum is swinging towards industrial policy. So I agree, as we heard, there are certain objectives we want to achieve with industrial policy, so green energy transition, resilience of value chains, reindustrialization in the case of the US. Second, popular demand. I showed you the results from surveys showing people want more state intervention. And I think that's driven by the last few decades of upheaval. We had globalization and automation reshaping the industrial landscape, geography of manufacturing. AI is promising to bring a revolution to services and some employment in some subsectors. Green transition will require big structural changes and therefore people changing jobs. And I think there is a longing for some stability and for some faith that somebody is in charge and somebody is overseeing these big changes. And then third, countries are doing industrial policy because others are doing that. So, in Europe, we see the US doing IRA, we see China doing industrial policy, and then there's the Draghi report, which talks about Europe falling behind. So what's the answer? Well, it's the industrial policy. It's investing in sectors of tomorrow. Now, in the old days, it used to be called picking winners. Now, if you want to pick winners, and if we let the governments pick winners, we need to give governments the ability to correct the course. So it's equally important to be able to let losers go. And that's why when I talked about disturbing features of industrial policy, I pointed out the lack of expiration date, the lack of end date. Because if you don't have an end date, the policy is never going to end and you will not correct the course. Finally, Joe was mentioning East Asian countries. One of the reasons why their industrial policies worked because their aim was export-led manufacturing. So bringing in global competition was built into the policy. Think about Latin American countries that wanted to build their own car industry and their own computer industry behind tariff walls. They have not succeeded because there was no competition to make a correction.
Okay, thank you. Rana, just coming back to you as well, because Jeromin, I think I wrote it down, said the pendulum isn't swinging from state to market, but us versus them. And I just wondered what your response was to that, because it's a slightly different version of what you said, I think, really, isn't it?
Well, I think in some ways both things are true. There's certainly some us v. them going on, and to be perfectly honest with you, there's going to be a lot more under Donald Trump, because his version of I don't even want to call it industrial policy, frankly. His policy will be to use some of the same tools that Joe Biden has used, I think, in quite a thoughtful way, and I can say more about that, to increase resilience, to create multiple nodes of production and consumption, to lift workers up and reconnect the interests of voters in the nation state with the global market system. That was the Biden approach. The Trump approach will be very much to see the global economy as a kind of a poker table in which the US consumer market will be used as a chit. And I think that when we think about, for example, the tariffs that we've just seen announced, and I stress announced because I will not believe anything until it's actually in ink and being being done by this administration. We see tariffs announced on Canada, Mexico, and China. This is a bargaining tool, and this is punitive, and there's going to be a lot of back and forth. And this is a great example of, I don't even want to call it industrial policy because it's not a 360 policy. It's simply an example of a protectionist strategy being used in a punitive way. So I think we kind of have to be clear about what's happening. And one of the things that I found quite fascinating over the few years is the way in which, as someone in the media rather than academic, is kind of trying to make sense of the big picture and the language that we use to speak about all these things. It's amazing to me that my own newspaper, but also the European media in general, has put Joe Biden and Donald Trump and their policies often in the same basket. Believe me, they're not in the same basket. And although the IRA, for example, was something that Europe was surprised by, I mean, I think in part because they were amazed that America would do anything around climate, rightly so. But I think was actually a first attempt at something that was about the pendulum shifting, in the sense that, just as Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, said, the Washington consensus is broken. We know growth qua growth no longer works. It's created a vast inequality and environmental disasters. So we need growth that is inclusive, meaning labor, and sustainable, meaning environment. This was a first stab. And I think had we seen a second Democratic administration, we probably would have seen a pretty robust cross-Atlantic conversation about, all right, how do we square this more industrial strategy, where we have a war on climate US approach with, say, a carbon border adjustment tax in Europe? How can those things work? By the way, one thing that and I know I'm going on a bit, but this is an important point. One thing I will say that I think Europe has missed in the US approach under Biden is that the reason the Biden administration didn't go with something like a carbon border adjustment tax in the US is that it was worried that the system is so captured by banks, by the large oil companies, by a lot of players that have not been acknowledged as entities, that this system simply wouldn't work in the US context, that we needed something that was being top down, given from the public sector to companies as a signaling message. But I think that those things would have evolved, and the details and the means, the ways and means would have come to be worked out. Anyway, that's probably too much, but there you go.
Thank you. No, fascinating. I think I heard poker chips, not potato chips, there as well. But let's just stay on tariffs. I want to ask Joe this question, actually. We now know, or at least we probably know, who's going to be the new Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and he wrote a piece for The Economist just before the election, where I'm just quoting here: interventions at the macroeconomic level, like broad-based tariffs, will be more effective than microeconomic interventions like industrial policy. What do you make of that?
Well, I think I agree with Rana that these are bargaining chips, poker chips, and that what worries me, knowing what happened in Trump's previous administration, is that they will be, to put it bluntly, very corrupt. The president has an enormous amount of discretion to give exemptions. And I saw a recent article saying that the exemptions that were given in the previous administration were basically correlated with campaign contributions to the Republican Party. The higher tariffs open up even more potential for corruption. And here I want to really reemphasize what Rana said. They're not interested in industrial policy in the sense that we've talked about it, and in the sense that the EBRD report focuses on: correcting market failures, addressing instances where the market won't take care of certain objectives like resilience and green. They are a part of a strategy in a world that is viewed as zero sum, that we get more and they get less. One more point I just want to make very briefly. It is very interesting to me that people who believe in the market are at the same time not articulating why it is that the market won't win in this competition. And if they really believe in the market should make us the most efficient. Jake Sullivan talked a little bit about unfair competition, but even he failed to know in what ways was it unfair, and why, the argument, if government is intervening, it's distorting. And the argument, if it's distorting, it should be bad for the economy. And yet it is true, I think most of us believe, that interventions can work to make an economy stronger. And that has to do with the market failures, including the failure markets to locate correctly, to address risk in terms of resilience, and choose a green economy.
Microphone's not working here. Probably should bring it closer back to home a bit now. And I want to come to you, Jeromin, actually. We've talked about what's going on in the US. What about, I'd like to ask about the Draghi report, actually. And I know you're not the EU think tank, so apologies for that. But tell me, what do you think we are going to see from that report? What is actually going to happen from that report under the new commission?
So maybe in the spirit of interactiveness, can I still say something in reaction to Rana? So first of all, I completely agree with you, Rana, that Trump is going to be, order of magnitude worse than Biden. Second, I also agree, and I've actually written this, that particularly from a European perspective, it's better to have the IRA than not to have it, because it's the main way in which the US can do climate change. It was completely critical in that sense. But the things that are really concerning, even about the Biden approach, which is so much better than the Trump approach, is threefold. First, this was the first time that the US sort of really openly flaunted WTO rules, which I do think are important to prevent a descent into a free-for-all tariffs and so forth. And this was done through the local content requirement. Second, Trump and Biden have in common the objective of effectively reshoring industrial jobs to the United States. And from a developing country perspective, I think this is pretty bad. I mean, it's essentially a policy failure of the US, which is solved by taking away jobs that at some level rightfully belong to developing countries, precisely by the logic of Alexander Hamilton, namely that countries should learn to do stuff at the beginning of that chain of development, and then bringing them back to the US. And then the third real concern I had, and now even more, of course, with Trump, is that from the perspective of global climate mitigation, you can take this anti-China stuff too far by, in effect, prohibiting imports into the United States or making them much more difficult to sell in the US if they have Chinese local content. But Chinese local content is, in many ways, the cheapest local content, and there's genuine trade-off in trying to, in a sense, keep the US and advanced countries free of Chinese content, and the green transition happening in developing countries. So in that sense, there is a trade-off. So I'm concerned about that. On the Draghi report, so look, the Draghi report is fantastic. It basically says, look, we can do so much more if we do it together at the European level. Completely agree. There's a whole agenda around innovation, structural reform, single market, which I completely agree. And it calls for sort of breaking the taboo of doing public investment at the EU level. And I also agree with that, right? So it is a step into sort of a more centralized fiscal approach, which I completely agree with. It also shares some features of Bidenomics that I don't like. So it is essentially Bidenomics applied to Europe. So just like Bidenomics, it takes the view that local content requirements are fine. And then it also plays a defensive game on the industrial jobs, which is understandable in Europe because, we so depend particularly on the automotive industry because we have suffered a terrible energy shock, unlike the US, because our energy in intensive industries might collapse in a disorderly way and because we are facing what is arguably unfair competition in some areas from China. And so he basically endorses industrial policy along at least two dimensions. First, he kind of copies the US approach from the IRA on clean tech, supported by local content requirement. But second, he also argues for subsidies conditional on abatement targets. So these are not unconditional targets, to his great credit, but conditional on abatement to energy-intensive industry. And sort of the big two questions that any intelligent discussion of industrial policy has to answer are not answered in the report. And those are, how far do we go on this pendulum between state and markets? Because, of course, the point of industrial policy is to correct a market failure. But is the structural transformation of Europe, is the change in the industrial geography of Europe, where in energy-intensive industries are spun off, either to the south of Europe or outside Europe, is that a market failure? Or is that sort of necessary structural change? And to what extent should we resist that, right? To what extent is it useful to, for example, raise fiscal burdens and energy prices for everyone else in Europe in order to support energy-intensive industry and resist that structural change? So I completely buy the idea that this cannot happen in a disorderly way. It can go too far. But where exactly what is the trade-off exactly? And so here the report is not completely. It doesn't have the answers, perhaps because it's too hard. And then my second concern is that the report does take the same view as Biden to trade policy, which is, almost literally, trade policy should be in the service of industrial policy. And I think even though, I like industrial policy of the kind that we have said, and I do think that, trade policy has an element of that. I think the really most important part of trade policy is to facilitate a lot of international trade, to the benefit of all trading partners. And that's why the WTO is there. That doesn't mean that the WTO is perfect. Maybe it was not conducive enough to the development of the poor countries, but the type of economic nationalism that we are now seeing both in the US on steroids with Trump and increasingly in the EU is going to be even less conducive to the interests of developing countries.
Thank you. So the market failure you talk about and the possibility of jobs being spun off or industries being spun off to other countries, those are our countries as well you're talking about, yes? I'm sorry? Those are EBRD countries you're talking about?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there is a specific problem. Now, we are not there yet, and there's also, of course, the possibility that, aggressive industrial policy that promotes certain sectors in the West is going to have, if you like, trickle-down effects through the value chain and help the region, right? But that really depends on not having too much discrimination in those policies, right? In allowing, meaningful parts of the value chain to be spun off. But if you read, pieces written by former Biden administration people on how, for example, one should get developing countries to do the green transition, it does sound rather like a division of labor of the 19th century, which is, we give them lots of money on two conditions. One is they decarbonize, and B, they send us the raw materials. I mean, it's a little bit neo-colonial. It's not really about helping drag up those countries the industrial chain.
Mm-hmm. So, Beata, in terms of how the Draghi report has been received in the EBRD countries outside of the EU, what's your perspective, do you think?
Well, let me start with the EU countries. I think there has been a bit of unhappiness in Eastern European EU member states about locals not being consulted. And there is some perception that this is a report about the old Europe. But I think that's a wrong perception because the report is about how to catch up, how to stimulate innovation. And in that sense, that's a question that's relevant to some of our most successful countries of operations, which for 30 years have been catching up and now need to grow based on their innovation, their own innovation. So this question of how you stimulate your own innovation is very relevant. But if I may come back to the point you made about industrial policy undermining the WTO, that matters for our countries outside of the EU. Because WTO is not just about market access, it's also about limiting your own tariff. It's a commitment device not to raise your tariffs above a certain level. And some of our countries have, volatile governments. They are not always a model of governance. So once this restraining force, this commitment device is gone, they actually may follow the protectionist path. And that's not something that would be good for them.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to just take one question each to Rana and Joe. Then I'm going to go to some of the audience questions, which I probably will put to you, but I haven't seen them yet, so I don't know. Rana, I just wanted to ask you, you were talking right at the beginning about resilience. And I just wonder if I could ask you, how do you think you can, an industrial policy can balance national security concerns with the principles of free trade and globalization? How do those two things balance?
Well, it's a great point, and let me make 3 points in response. First of all, I want to actually go to something that Jeromin had said about, Adam Smith quite rightly thinking about the trade-off between free markets and industrial strategy. Ricardo actually thought about it too, interestingly, and this gets to some of the discussion on trade. In the principles of political economy and taxation, the classic wine for cloth, trade that everybody uses to think about the trade economy still today, which I always find amazing. But there was a lesser known passage there about how there was no worry about resiliency because Ricardo thought that the patriotism of capitalists in the nation state would actually prevent them from outsourcing entire supply chains, and which goes to show that he had never met a private equity baron, and I think that it also speaks to some of our some classical notions that may need to be updated, rethought, and Joe and others are doing brilliant work around all of that. But to your specific point about how national security concerns balance with free trade and globalization, I'm going to give you a dark example and then a more positive one. The dark example, sadly, is the one that we're in right now, which is that this debate around sort of big tech, for example, in the US being a national champion in some sort of AI strategic battle with China, which was always ridiculous because companies are about making profit and there's an asymmetry there. Big tech companies would be happy to work in China if they were allowed to. They would be happy to work anywhere they're allowed to. So these are not national champions. These are monopoly powers. That's now been put on steroids under Trump, who has elevated Elon Musk, and even less reliable actors in Silicon Valley to serious positions of power. I mean, Palantir may be taking over the industrial defense complex. The crypto titans may be wittingly or unwittingly trying to undermine the dollar. So this is, I wouldn't even call it nationalism. I would call it a kind of an American oligopoly. That's the dark side. Here's a more positive example. And interestingly, it may have a chance to survive even under Trump. A few months ago, the Biden administration signed with Finland and with Canada a deal to make icebreakers. Icebreakers are, ships that go into the Arctic. They're necessary, more necessary than ever before because global commerce is opening up, rare earths, more geostrategic activity in the area. The U.S. has been trying to make an icebreaker unsuccessfully in Mississippi for the last 5 years because we have a large monopoly power company that is inefficient and a workforce whose skills have atrophied for 40 years. The Finns can churn out an icebreaker every 18 months. after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a Canadian company bought the largest Russian oligarch's asset in Helsinki, which was a shipyard. There is now a very, I think, smart, inclusive, strategic geopolitical plan to do a shared industrial strategy where the Finns are going to go to Mississippi using Canadian resources and US resources and skill up a workforce. That's pretty interesting. And yes, it's small, but it's a little gem that shows you what's possible. And I would also say it very much touches on Catherine Tai, the USTR Catherine Tai's strategy of a post-colonial trade paradigm in which we start with alliances of values. We bring in countries, yes, maybe some of them in part for rare earth minerals, but there is tech transfer to those countries. This is not a zero-sum game. This is not a colonial paradigm. This is a new trade paradigm for a new era. Now, Trump certainly wants the Finns to build icebreakers. How that happens and whether or not you're going to see a handful of people owning the wealth from that and whether you're actually going to see a U.S. labor force trained up, big questions now.
Okay, thank you. Joe, I mean, similar kind of question, really. I just wonder, given what we've been hearing about the geopolitical context, do you think we are nearing the end of a kind of open economy as we know it? Is that where this is taking us?
No, I think we're going to still remain open because we are necessarily interdependent. But what was very clear that we took neoliberalism too far. We developed supply chains that were not resilient, that were fragile, as we saw in COVID-19 and during the pandemic. So I think we are moving away from you might say, the ideology that prevailed for 40 years that was based, I think, on a set of hypotheses that were hard to justify, like Rana mentioned, the goodwill of our entrepreneurs, not to that they would actually think about something more than the short run and think about their national patriotism. I mean, we can't expect that. So we have to do a correction. Let me add 2 points that the discussion, I think, has highlighted. One, we are in a period of structural change, and market failures are particularly evident in periods of structural change. The imperfections of capital markets, the limitations of human capital, all of these. So the fact that we are in a structural change period means that we are in a period in which we may need more government intervention than we would need in a more stable period where there's less change. The second thing is that I think the interests of the developing countries are at risk. And this relates to the third point. We really do need to keep a focus on market failures because otherwise you wind up with a corrupt agenda where you get industrial policies captured by one interest or another. And what has worried me in a lot of the industrial policies that US and Europe are undertaking, they are industrial policies which require a lot of fiscal space, and the developing countries can't compete. And then when they engage in their form of industrial policy, which may be trade restrictions or other, discriminatory, they say, oh, you can't do that. So because the advanced countries have more tools, they really do force some of the developing countries and emerging markets to use less efficient tools in order to keep somewhat of a level playing field. But the problem will be exacerbated if the developed countries, the advanced countries, take their eye off of the problem of market failures. So the rules-based system, in a way, did serve in the past the interests of the developing countries. In some ways, particularly countries like China that were able to catch up. But for many of the other countries, it did preserve the neo-colonial patterns of trade. And we now have to think a little bit more about how we can move away from that neo-colonial pattern. We have to realize that TRIPS, the intellectual property provisions of the WTO, really were a failure, evident so strongly during the pandemic. And how do we, as I say, pursue this new industrial policy without putting the developing countries at a disadvantage?
Thank you. Yeah, that point about fiscal space is covered in the transition report, actually. It's a really important one. I'm staying with that theme, actually, and I'm going to come to you, Jeromin, for this. A question that's come from somebody in the audience. How can small economies compete globally when big economic blocs, EU, US, China, use industrial policy? Do they have to pick a side to compete?
So, I mean, whether they have to pick a side will depend on how far some of the advanced countries, in particular the US under Trump, take it, right, in defining who can trade with the US. So I hope that in that sense it will not go too far. But on the broader issue of how can small economies compete, I mean, I think there's both bad news and good news. The bad news is the point that Joe made, which is that it's going to be just a lot tougher in an international subsidies race for the small guys to keep up, right? And this is essentially the same argument we have within the EU, and the reason why we have state aid rules within the EU, but this does not exist internationally. The good news is that it is still possible to find niches, and that if your economy is very small, in a sense, you have no alternative but to treat the international market as the growth market. And so as long as you maintain market access, I think you can find your own path. The really difficult thing is if we have really the essentially rules-based trade falling apart, and we are back in a world where countries, including the large industrial countries, and possibly China, retreat behind tariff walls.
Okay, thank you. Another question here. Beata, I'm going to ask you this, actually, because it relates to some of the topics that were covered in the report. The question is, which sectors should industrial policy focus on throughout EBRD countries? And I wonder, actually, in the report, there's quite a few examples of areas where we can see industrial policy working well. So, for example, I think younger companies you pick out. I just wonder if you could pick out some of the obvious potential that's there that you can see having studied this.
So, picking winners, picking sectors is difficult unless you have the ability to correct course. So in our countries of operations where governance is not optimal, starting subsidies or starting industrial policy that targets particular sectors is quite dangerous, because you will never finish it. Because these sectors, infant industry protection is sort of a classical example. Infants never grow up because instead of focusing on improving their productivity, they focus on ensuring continued flow of protection. So I think in our countries, I would advocate more horizontal policies. You want to promote R&D, have tax credits for R&D. You want to promote innovation, have venture funds for startups. What comes back in fashion is this mission-based approach where you state a goal and you distribute funding to fund innovation in particular areas. And the hope is that this will result not only in innovation in this area, but it will create other innovations, right? Internet being here a sort of often used example in the context of DARPA.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I've got 2 more questions I'm going to ask, one to Rana and then one to Joe. And if you could be brief with your answers, because we're getting towards the end. And Rana, I'm asking you this because you're the only one that's kind of outside or has been outside the multilateral development bank system. So the question is, what should MDBs be doing in this space? What's the role that we can play here particularly in the gap that's developing between developing and developed countries?
That's a great question. It's not one that I had thought about specifically, I must say. I think I would build, I guess, on what Joe has already said, that there's a body of data and work that's being done right now that is helping us to fill in the picture of what's helpful and what's working and what's really not. And to me, this report is a great example of that. I think continuing to build that body of work and, really help to build whatever the new unified field theory is going to be of globalization, the global trade system, the global economy, and how it can and should work to create growth that is sustainable and inclusive. I would think that development banks could play a really important role in that, and that would be a great place to put resources.
So much, thank you. Okay, and Joe, this relates to something you said earlier, but this one's in the context of Europe. Should the EU concede the dominance of the EV industry to China, or stay the course with state subsidies? And you talked about that in a US context earlier, but do we give up on EVs?
No, I think that it is important for Europe to have those manufacturing capacities, learn, but the way to do it is not to keep out Chinese EVs, but to increase your own capacity. In particular, this addresses the issue that was discussed very briefly, multiple objectives. We want a green transition. We also want to enhance capabilities as part of the structural transformation. Right now, I view the existential issue is climate change. And so we want to facilitate that green transition as quickly as possible. And that means solar panels, EVs now. But I don't want Europe to be reliant on Chinese EVs, just Chinese. And that means you may have to do fiscal subsidies, R&D subsidies to help bring up the capacity, recognizing that China began on this venture 15, 20 years ago, that they have more engineers, that they were more foresighted. We were not sufficiently foresighted. Let's give them credit for what they've done and the contributions which they're making for climate change. There's one more point I want to make. It isn't so much picking winners that is the objective of industrial policy. If there's learning by doing, but it only affects the firms, and if capital markets worked well, then the firm would have the right incentive. It would realize that it's going to be more productive. It would be part of the investment, and there would be no reason for state aid. Where state aid comes is cross-firm and cross-sectoral externalities, spillovers, learning spillovers, institutional spillovers. It's not the infant industry argument that is important. It is slightly important related to credit market imperfections, but what is of importance is the infant economy argument, where there are important spillovers across sectors. And this distinction is, I think, an important distinction, which has often gotten lost in the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for adding that point there. Okay, that's the end of the questions for now. I'd just like perhaps to ask Beata to conclude, having heard the conversation, fascinating conversation over the last 45 minutes. What do you think are the lessons that you can draw for the countries that we work in, specifically, having heard this conversation?
Well, we have heard many reasons for why industrial policy may be justified. So I think the lesson to me is, if you do industrial policy, be clear about its objective or objectives and have a clear hierarchy of objectives, because only then you're able to tell whether you are succeeding in your efforts.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so we're going to finish it here. If you want to read the full transition report, I know a lot of you in the room have already collected a copy, but you can read it online at 2024.tr-ebrd.com. Is that up on the screen somewhere? If not now, it will be soon. I want to say thank you to the people that produced this event today. Thank you to the production team for the report, which is as much a work of art, I think, as a piece of excellent analysis. We'll be posting a podcast version of today's session later, which you can download on iTunes and plug. If you review and rate it, that will help others to find it, really. Most of all, I just want to thank our guests, actually. It's been a real privilege listening to them. So much knowledge and insight, fantastic panel. So Rana Foroohar, Joe Stiglitz, and Jeromin Zettelmeyer, and of course, Beata Javorcik. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And please join us outside for a glass or something. Thank you.